It is just past 3 in the morning on December 25th, 1944, and the fields west of Bastogne are silent under a hard frost. Snow lies thick across the Belgian plateau, glowing faintly blue in the moonlight, and the temperature has dropped to nearly minus 15 degrees Celsius. Inside a shattered farmhouse near the village of Hemroulle, a young American paratrooper presses his back against a cold stone wall and listens. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, engines are turning over. Dozens of them. The sound carries strangely across frozen ground, a low mechanical growl that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. For 6 days, the men of the 101st Airborne Division have held this town while an entire German army encircled them. They have fought without enough ammunition, without enough food, without winter coats, and without any real hope of reinforcement. 4 days earlier, when a German officer under a flag of truce demanded their surrender, the American commander sent back a single word that would become legend: nuts. Now, on the morning that was supposed to bring peace, the Germans intend to make good on the threat behind that demand. Adolf Hitler himself has ordered this attack. He wants Bastogne taken before Christmas dinner is served in Berlin, and he has thrown one of his last reserves of tanks and grenadiers at the weakest point in the American line to make it happen. What is about to unfold in the fields around Hemroulle and Chasse is not one of the war's great strategic turning points. It will not appear on many maps, but it represents something sharper and more immediate. The final desperate throw of Germany's last great offensive in the West, aimed squarely at a town that refused to fall, defended by soldiers who had already run out of almost everything except the will to keep fighting. The paratrooper by the farmhouse wall does not know any of this larger picture. He knows only that the engine noise is getting louder, and that somewhere in the dark, tanks are moving towards him across the snow. The Battle of the Bulge had begun 9 days earlier as Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West, a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest intended to split the American and British armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the war reached German soil. It was, on paper, an almost impossible plan for December 1944. Germany's fuel reserves were dangerously low. Its air force had been battered into near irrelevance, and its once feared panzer divisions were now filled with hastily trained conscripts and worn-out machines patched together from scavenged parts. Yet secrecy and appalling winter weather, which grounded Allied aircraft for days, allowed the Germans to achieve near-total surprise when the offensive opened on December 16th. Bastogne sat at the center of the problem. 7 paved roads converged on the small market town, making it the single most important road junction in the entire Ardennes region. Without it, German armored columns pushing towards the River Meuse would be forced onto narrow secondary roads entirely unsuited to the movement of tanks, fuel lorries, and the thousands of vehicles a modern offensive required. German planners had assumed Bastogne would fall within the first 2 or 3 days. Instead, elements of the American 101st Airborne Division rushed into the town by lorry on December 18th and 19th with barely any winter equipment and desperately short of ammunition, dug in and refused to move. What followed was a siege in the truest sense of the word. By December 21st, German forces had completely encircled the town, cutting off the roughly 18,000 American soldiers trapped inside from any hope of resupply by land. Medical supplies ran out almost immediately, forcing surgeons to operate without adequate anesthetic. Ammunition for the artillery batteries was rationed to a handful of shells per gun per day. Food supplies dwindled to almost nothing, and men survived on whatever could be scavenged from abandoned houses and barns. Temperatures fell well below freezing most nights, and cases of frostbite and trench foot multiplied among soldiers who had arrived in the Ardennes wearing autumn uniforms, never expecting to face a Belgian winter in the field. The German demand for surrender on December 22nd was not an idle gesture. By any conventional military calculation, the American position was hopeless. They were outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded on all sides, and cut off from resupply, with winter weather preventing the aerial drops that might have saved them. When Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, was handed the German ultimatum, his famous one-word reply expressed something closer to defiance than confidence. The situation genuinely was as dire as the Germans believed. What the American commanders could not know was whether a relief force under General George Patton, racing north from Luxembourg, would arrive before the German army mustered the strength for one final, overwhelming assault. That assault was now only days away, and it was being prepared with a force the defenders of Bastogne had not yet faced in full. Weather compounded every difficulty facing the defenders. The same low cloud and fog that had allowed the German offensive to achieve surprise on December 16th also grounded Allied fighter bombers for the best part of a week, denying the men inside Bastogne the close air support that might otherwise have blunted German attacks well before they reached the perimeter. Supply drops by parachute, when the weather finally cleared enough to attempt them on December 23rd, brought welcome relief in the form of ammunition, medical supplies, and food, but nowhere near enough to erase the shortages that had built up over the preceding days. Artillery crews still found themselves counting shells individually before firing, wary of exhausting their supply in the middle of an attack. For the wounded, conditions were especially grim. The field hospital originally established to treat casualties had been captured intact by a German raiding party on December 19th, forcing surgeons to improvise treatment in cellars and outbuildings with whatever instruments and drugs could be gathered from captured German stocks or scavenged from the town itself. The force assembling for the Christmas attack was built around the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, transferred from the German 9th Army and reinforced with tanks from the 115th Panzer Regiment, adding real armored weight to an assault that earlier attempts on the town's perimeter had lacked. The plan, drawn up under pressure from Hitler's headquarters, called for a concentrated strike from the west and northwest, aimed at the villages of Hemroulle and Champs, where the American line was thinnest and where open, snow-covered farmland offered German tanks a relatively clear run towards the town itself. The attacking force numbered somewhere in the region of 30 tanks, mostly Panzer IV medium tanks supported by a smaller number of the newer Panther models, accompanied by roughly 2 battalions of infantry mounted on half-tracks and on foot. Compared to the vast Panzer armadas that had spearheaded the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, this was a modest force, but it represented nearly everything German commanders in the sector had left to throw at Bastogne. The plan depended on speed and darkness. German commanders intended to punch through the thin American perimeter before first light, using the tanks to break the line and the grenadiers to exploit the gap and pour into the town itself. Facing them were elements of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, dug into hastily prepared positions around Hemroulle and Champs, supported by a handful of American tanks and self-propelled tank destroyers from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. American artillery, though desperately short of shells for much of the siege, had received a small resupply by air a few days earlier, giving gun crews just enough ammunition to matter in the hours ahead. The defenders had also had time, unlike in the earliest days of the siege, to lay some anti-tank mines and register their few remaining guns on the likely approach routes. The ground itself played its own part in the coming battle. The plateau west of Bastogne is largely open farmland, broken only by scattered hedgerows, isolated farm buildings, and shallow folds in the terrain, offering little natural cover to an attacking force once daylight arrived. For infantry advancing on foot behind tanks, this meant that once the initial surprise of a night attack wore off, there was almost nowhere to hide from artillery observation. German commanders were gambling that speed, and darkness would carry their forces across this exposed ground before American gunners could bring effective fire to bear. It was a reasonable gamble in principle, and for the first hour or so of the attack it appeared to be paying off. The attack began in darkness, the German tanks and infantry moving forward across open snowfields towards Hemroulle in the small hours of Christmas morning. For a brief period, it worked. German tanks broke through a gap in the thinly held line, and grenadiers on foot followed close behind, pushing towards the village itself, and, for a short time, threatening to reach the edge of Bastogne. American forward positions were overrun or forced back, and confused. Close-range fighting broke out in the freezing dark among farm buildings and hedgerows barely visible in the winter gloom. What turned the battle was a combination of artillery, armor, and sheer determination among the defenders. American tank destroyers, brought up in support, engaged the German tanks at close range as daylight began to break, destroying several of the lead vehicles and breaking the momentum of the assault. Artillery batteries inside the perimeter, their gunners now able to see the attacking force clearly against the snow, poured fire into the following infantry, who found themselves caught in the open with almost no cover. American glider infantrymen, many of them exhausted after days of continuous combat and desperately low on ammunition themselves, held their ground in fighting positions around Hemroulle and, in places, fought hand-to-hand as the German advance faltered and then collapsed. By mid-morning on Christmas Day, the attack had been broken. German tanks that had penetrated the American line were destroyed or forced to withdraw, and the accompanying infantry, having lost the armored support that made the assault viable, fell back under continuing artillery fire. It is worth pausing on the scale of what had just happened. A concentrated attack by roughly 30 tanks and 2 battalions of infantry, prepared specifically to break the siege of Bastogne on Hitler's personal order, had been stopped within a matter of hours by a defending force that was exhausted, half-frozen, and still desperately short of supplies. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Exact casualty figures for the Christmas Day fighting around Hemroulle remain difficult to pin down with precision, as combat records from the siege are fragmentary and often contradictory, a common problem in fast-moving Ardennes fighting where units were frequently cut off from their own headquarters. What can be said with confidence is that German losses in tanks were severe relative to the size of the attacking force, with multiple vehicles destroyed or abandoned on the battlefield, while American losses, though real, were far lighter than they might have been had the line simply given way. The comparison with earlier German attempts to crack the Bastogne perimeter is instructive. In the days before Christmas, German commanders had launched a series of smaller, less coordinated probes against the American lines, none of which came close to threatening the town itself. The Christmas Day attack was different precisely because it concentrated real armored strength, however modest by the standards of earlier in the war, against a single weak point rather than dissipating it across the whole perimeter. It was, in effect, the last serious attempt by conventional German military planning to solve the Bastogne problem through direct assault, and its failure marked the effective end of any German hope of taking the town by force before Patton's relief column arrived. It is worth setting this German effort against what American forces achieved with comparatively modest resources of their own. The defenders at Hemroulle had no fresh reinforcements, no significant reserve of ammunition, and no realistic prospect of retreat, since the town was entirely surrounded. What they had was a handful of tank destroyers, a battered but functioning artillery arm, and infantrymen who had already endured a week of siege conditions without breaking. Against a concentrated attack of 30-odd tanks, this was, on paper, a mismatch that should have favored the Germans decisively. That it did not speaks less to any single piece of equipment or tactic and more to the cumulative effect of prepared positions, however hasty, combined with artillery observers who could see clearly across open, snow-covered ground. German accounts of the broader Ardennes offensive frequently note that by late December, fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and the sheer difficulty of resupply over congested, icy roads had begun to erode the combat power of even well-equipped panzer units. The force that attacked Hemroulle on Christmas morning likely reflected these broader strains, arriving at the battlefield with less fuel margin and fewer functioning vehicles than its nominal strength suggested. American units, while equally exhausted, benefited from operating within a static perimeter where positions had been reconnoitered and, in places, mined in the days beforehand, giving the defense a structural advantage that raw numbers alone do not capture. The failure of the Christmas Day attack did not end the siege of Bastogne immediately, but it marked the last moment at which German forces held a realistic chance of taking the town by direct assault before outside relief arrived. On the afternoon of December 26th, lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German cordon south of the town near the village of Hemroulle, opening a narrow corridor that allowed supplies and eventually reinforcements to reach the exhausted defenders. The siege, in the strict sense of complete encirclement, was over. The material impact of holding Bastogne is not difficult to state. By denying German forces the road network running through the town for an entire critical week, the defenders forced enemy armored columns onto narrower, less suitable routes further to the south, slowing the overall pace of the German advance towards the Meuse at precisely the moment when time mattered most to German planners hoping to reach Antwerp before Allied reserves could respond. The psychological impact is harder to quantify but was, if anything, more significant. News of the siege, and particularly of McAuliffe's blunt refusal to surrender, spread quickly through American and British newspapers in the final days of December 1944, offering a story of stubborn defiance against apparently hopeless odds that resonated far beyond the muddy fields of Belgium. The Christmas Day fighting at Bastogne also fed directly into how the wider Ardennes offensive would come to be understood in the months and years that followed. Historians assessing the campaign have generally treated the failure of this attack as the moment German operational hopes in the sector finally ran out, not because Bastogne alone determined the fate of the entire offensive, but because it removed the last plausible route by which German forces might have converted a stalled advance into a genuine breakthrough towards the Meuse. From this point onward, German planning in the Ardennes shifted from offense to survival, as Allied reinforcements poured into the salient from the north and south and began the slow, costly work of pushing the Bulge back to its starting line. The men who fought at Hemroulle on Christmas morning left behind a battlefield that can still be visited today. The fields west of Bastogne remain largely agricultural, and a network of memorials and small museums around the town, including the Bastogne War Museum itself, preserves both equipment and personal accounts from the siege. Several of the destroyed German tanks were recovered or scrapped in the years after the war, though the positions the defenders held around Hemroulle and Champs are still marked, and the terrain itself, flat, open, and exposed, makes it easy to understand why the fighting there was so costly for the attacking force. It is just past 3 a.m. on December 25, 1944, and the fields west of Bastogne are silent under a hard frost. That is where this story began, and it is worth returning to that image now, because what happened in the hours that followed changed remarkably little on the map of Europe, and everything about how that week would be remembered. 30 tanks came out of the tree line that morning, sent forward on the personal order of a man who believed one final push would break a town that had already refused every previous demand to surrender. By mid-morning, the tanks that had not been destroyed were withdrawing across the same snow they had crossed hours before, leaving behind wreckage and leaving behind a perimeter that had, against every reasonable expectation, held. No new ground was won that Christmas morning. No great maneuver was executed. What happened instead was smaller and, in its way, more remarkable. Exhausted men in freezing positions, almost out of ammunition, almost out of food, entirely out of any illusion about how desperate their situation was, held a line against the last serious armored assault the German army in the Ardennes could muster. They held it not because the odds favored them, but because they had already decided, 4 days earlier, in a single defiant word, that surrender was not a question worth answering twice. The Battle of the Bulge would grind on for another month before the Ardennes front was finally stabilized and pushed back to its original line. Bastogne itself would remain a contested, dangerous place for weeks after Christmas, shelled and fought over even as the immediate crisis of encirclement passed. But the attack on Christmas morning marked the last moment when the town's fall was ever seriously in doubt. After it failed, German commanders in the sector shifted from attempting to take Bastogne to simply trying to contain it, a tacit admission that the town and the men inside it had won. There were no survivors among the German tanks that broke through the line towards Hemroulle that morning. There was, in the end, no victory for the men who had been ordered to take a town on Christmas Day as a gift for their Führer. What there was, instead, was a frozen field outside a small Belgian town, a handful of wrecked tanks steaming faintly in the cold morning air, and several thousand exhausted American soldiers who had, once again, simply refused to leave.